So welcome to all the participants and also to the honorable members of the Parliament. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is the first webinar organized between Europe for Family and MEP Margarita de la Pisa Carrion. The topic of today is the reproductive exploitation, also called bellies renting, vientres de alquiler in Spanish, or maternity traffic. Thank you to the MEP Margarita de la Pisa for hosting this event, and welcome. Even if we aren't physically together at the European Parliament, it's a great joy to be here. Let me introduce you, Ms. de la Pisa. Mrs. de la Pisa, you have studied pharmacy at the Complutense University of Madrid, and you have worked as a pharmacy manager and also in the pharmaceutical industry, learning neuropsychology. You are actually one of the newest MEP as you entered into office last February, just after Brexit. At the European Parliament, you're a member of the Committee on Women's Rights, the Committee on Employment, and the Special Committee on Fight Against Cancer. As far as I understand, your involvement in the Spanish political party Vox was to be active on topics such as family, education, and women's issues. And precisely, you have asked to be informed on the issue of reproductive exploitation. All participants should get the English translation provided you press the English translation button on the globe at the bottom of your screen. If you want to read the original language, whether French, English, or Spanish, you don't have to select the translation. So Mrs. de la Pisa, please, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Matthew, for your introductory words. The subject that occupies us all today is beyond this, since any reflection on maternal exploitation will always be insufficient, because there are many dimensions of the human being that are affected. How can it be that such sophisticated scientific and technological advances have put us at such a crossroads? We live in a materialistic and hedonistic society where everything can be bought and nothing ever satisfies. In the 21st century, human beings are being sold. In the 21st century, women's bodies are being marketed. Children are being objectified and transformed into mere objects of desire. Yes, it seems that our wishes must be able to come true, even if it's against the natural law. But not content with this, it also calls for these wishes to be considered rights. To make it even more insidious, fundamental rights. Are we aware of the legal consequences that this applies? Do we account for the consequences at the human, anthropological, social, and psychological levels? Do we understand what steps we are taking and where we are going? Are we not playing God by not accepting, by not trusting that what He gives us exceeds even our own desires? That this is always a gift, even if a priori we do not know how to see it. Today, we are privileged to have Aude Mirkovic, spokesperson for Lawyers for Childhood, Roux, director from Alliance Vita International, Carmen Sanchez Maillo from One of Us, Laetitia Pouliquen, director of WomanAttitude. We thank you for your presence and hope that you will help us in this reflection that we share today. And finally, I would like us to end by thanking one of us and Europe for Family for their valuable help in organising this webinar.
Thank you. As you said, this is a very sensitive topic, not only because it involves personal stories, but also because things are changing in real time. We have found that the European Commission have the desire to move to a recognition of all forms of parenthood, which de facto would include intended parents of a child born through reproductive exploitation. That's what President Ursula von der Leyen. Adding that according to her, if you are parent in one country, you are parent in every country. And I quote the last State of the Union speech. Yesterday in Brussels, the AFET committee had the opportunity to condemn reproductive exploitation in various amendments from three different political groups, the APP, SCR, and even GUE. But the AFET committee actually decided not to vote, not taking those amendments into consideration. It was already the case in 2017 with the Tadeusz-Zwiefka report. They even didn't vote on the amendments. And we cannot let that happen because I'm sure that MEPs aren't willing to lay off vulnerable women trapped in reproductive exploitation. But we must convince people and be pedagogic, and that's one of the goals of this webinar. More information on the political fields will also be presented during this session, so stay tuned. And now I'm glad to introduce Professor Aude Mirkovic, the spokesperson of Lawyers for Childhood. Mrs. Aude Mirkovic is doctor in law and associated teacher in private law at the University of Évry, near Paris. She will present us the legal aspects of surrogacy. Her speech will take place in French, so you may click on the globe, the translation button at the bottom of the screen to hear the English translation. Mrs. Mirkovic, you have the floor.
Thank you. So, what is surrogate motherhood? It is a contract by which people agree with a woman that she will bear a child and give it to them at birth. These are couples in which the woman cannot bear a child due to a lack of uterus, for example, male couples, single men, or women who prefer to have the child carried by someone else. The child may be born of other applicants or from the surrogate mother's oocyte, or most often from the oocyte of another woman, an oocyte seller. National legislation ranges from explicit prohibition, as in France, to the organisation of practice by law, as in Greece or the United Kingdom, to the silence of the law on the subject in many states. Now, legal principles involved. First of all, human dignity. This seminar refers to the practice of maternity exploitation. Indeed, it organizes the instrumentalization of women since it presupposes the provision of the whole of a woman's body and therefore of her person. It is not a professional activity like any other because a woman does not stop being pregnant at the end of the day. The European Parliament characterizes this as violence against women, which constitutes an exploitation of women's bodies and reproductive organs. This exploitation refers to slavery, defined by the Geneva Convention as the status or condition of an individual on whom all of the attributes of the right of ownership are exercised. Indeed, the 24-hour availability of a woman, so intrusive in her intimacy and privacy, gives the applicants proprietary prerogatives. As Professor Muriel Fabre-Magnan points out, we are no longer in the age of old-fashioned slavery. There is no need to count the surrogate mother as an asset of her patrimony. Just use her. And in 2014, ECHR makes this link between SM and trafficking to judge that Belgium's refusal to issue a travel document to a child born from SM in Ukraine constitutes an interference in the private and family life of the persons concerned, but that this interference is justified by objectives of prevention of criminal offences, in particular the fight against trafficking in human beings. So, consent of the surrogate mother. Is it possible to refer to trafficking in this way when dealing with consenting women? The French Ethics Committee explains that while there is no ethics without consent, consent is not sufficient to give an action its legal legitimacy. Indeed, the legal system cannot accept consent as the only criterion. For example, the law cannot allow a mother to give her heart to her child, even if she consents. The woman's consent, real or forced, cannot justify exploitation. Voluntary slavery is undoubtedly the most perfidious because the victim does not complain. This is why, in French law, the offences that punish the new forms of trafficking include the working or housing conditions that are contrary to dignity, even though the persons thus exploited may consent or even be satisfied with their fate. The dignity of the child is also at stake. Unfortunately, good intentions do not change the content of the contract. The child is ordered, produced, and delivered. Contracts may indeed provide for a service to be provided to the child, such as medical contract or childcare. In SM, the child is the very object of the contract. Whoever gives or sells a child exercises on him the attributes of the right of ownership, abuse, disposition, the prerogative par excellence of the owner. A Désir d'Enfant trade fair was held in Paris at the beginning of September, and SM companies offered their services. Some offered a luxury formula guaranteeing a healthy child. How can we guarantee a healthy child? The clinic's sales representative explained, with a big smile to his customers, if the child does not suit you, don't worry, you can refuse him. He will go to the orphanage and you'll be given another free. The European Parliament warns that women and children are subject to the same forms of exploitation and can be seen as commodities on the international reproductive market. Another point is that the SM leads to the breakdown of maternity between 2 or even 3 women. A reproductive mother who provides the oocyte, a gestational mother who carries the child, and a mother of intent who wanted it. The conflict that can arise between these different women shows the embarrassment of determining who is the mother of the child. In the United States, the courts favour mothers of intent. In French law, on the contrary, the conflict was decided in favour of the surrogate mother, who had changed her mind 4 years after the birth of the child. The same diversity can be seen in the legislation governing SM in the United Kingdom. The surrogate mother can decide to keep the child. In Greece, only the woman commissioner can be recognised as the mother. These few examples illustrate the uncertainty introduced into motherhood. Moreover, when the child is ordered by a single man or couple of men, the SM deprives it not only of a clearly identified mother, but of a mother at all. Let us then ask the question, how can the programming of a child in a way that deprives him or her of his or her mother, or at the very least, taints his or her maternal filiation with uncertainty? How could this practice respect the International Convention of the Rights of the Child, according to which the child has the right to know and be brought up by his or her parents? Finally, the SM programs the abandonment of the child, not certainly in the sense that he or she be left alone in the street, but because he or she is separated from the woman who bore him. or her, which is experienced by him or her as abandonment. Separation at birth is intended to prevent attachment, but, as Belgian psychotherapist Anne Schaub explains, if an adult, in this case a woman, can decide not to become attached to the baby she is carrying for others, an embryo, a baby does not have this capacity. Therefore, separating the child from the one who carried it for 9 months and to whom it has become attached represents for the child a traumatic rupture in the child's nascent life. Is it true that children from SM are not the only ones to experience this separation, and in particular, children subsequently adopted have sometimes experienced the same thing? However, is SM comparable to adoption? No, because adoption repairs the damage suffered by the child deprived of one of or both of its parents, whereas SM organizes this deprivation, deletes the mother to make the child adoptable. This is why the French Court of Cassation has long rejected adoption after SM as a misappropriation of adoption. It accepts it today, but the question remains, how can the adoption of a child having evicted its mother from birth to make it adoptable be in its interests? The Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption prohibits the recognition of adoption where the consent of the biological parents has been obtained before birth and or in return for payment. However, this is precisely what the SM contract organizes. The mother's commitment to abandon the child, taken before birth and even before conception, almost always in return for payment. This is why, in Denmark, the Supreme Court has just refused the adoption of 2 children from SM in Ukraine by the father's wife on 16th of November 2020, as Danish law prohibits adoption when the woman who gave birth has been paid. As the Supreme Court judges recalled, this law aims to ensure that children are not treated as objects that can be bought and paid for. The question of adoption leads us to clarify the situation of children. Let's clear up a confusion. Children have a filiation that stems from their birth certificate drawn up in their country of birth. What some states refuse to transcribe, to register these foreign acts on their national civil status registers. In France, for example, the Court of Cassation has long refused transcription. It expressed its refusal to endorse the SM process, even when carried out abroad, and avoided encouraging the circumvention of French law. However, as the Court of Cassation stated, the absence of the transcript does not deprive the children of maternal or paternal filiation that California recognizes for them, nor does it prevent them from living with spouses X in France. As summarized by the French Ethics Committee, foreign civil status, whatever it may be, can always be used as it stands in France. This allows the child to live with the parents' intention to have access to care as well as school registration. Confusion is, however, widespread, including at the European Court of Human Rights, which condemned France in 2014 on the erroneous finding that the foreign filiation of children would not be recognized in France. The French Court of Cassation has changed its case law and now accepts the transcription of acts. The result is that the legal prohibition is deprived of effectiveness, since justice accepts to be confronted with fait accompli, and this is to the detriment of women and children who are deprived of the protection that its prohibition aims to provide them. In an opinion in 2019, the European Court clarified its position on maternity of intent. It requires that domestic law should provide a possibility for the recognition of a parent-child relationship between the child and the woman designated in the birth certificate as the legal mother. It does not, however, require transcription in civil status registers, as such recognition may be affected by other means, such as adoption. I will make 2 observations. Firstly, the European Court persists in considering that the foreign parentage of the child would not be recognized in domestic law, which is not correct as explained. Secondly, the court reduces the child's maternal filiation to the link with its mother of intention and takes no account of the erasure of the child's original maternal filiation. How can this be reconciled with its own case law, according to which privacy includes the right to identity, which includes the right to know and have one's ancestry recognized? The court ignores the invasion of the child's privacy that results from this deprivation of his maternal descent. It is only interested in a maternity of intention that adults have agreed between them. Regarding the decision of the Grand Chamber of the European Court has given judgment only once in an Italian case, Paradiso and Campanelli versus Italy on the 24th of January 2017. Italian spouses obtain a child in Russia for the sum of 50,000 euros through SM and appear as parents on the Russian birth certificate. Italy refuses to register the certificate and the child is placed for adoption in a foster family. An expertise will reveal the absence of a genetic link between the child and the couple. In 2015, the European Court condemned Italy, finding that the removal of the child for the couple and in placement under guardianship for adoption had damaged the family life of the couple. The Grand Chamber, on the other hand, ruled in 2017 that there was no family life in the case in question because of the unlawful nature of the situation and the absence of a biological link between the couple and the child. It finds an interference with the applicant's private life. This interference is justified by the protection of the child. Thus, and in this the major contribution of the judgment, the Grand Chamber takes account in its assessment of the facts of the unlawful origin of the situation, in this case, which the Chamber's judgment refused to do. Conclusion. What can be done to remedy these violations of women's and child's rights? Let's dispel the mirage of a supposedly ethical SM. Indeed, the violation of the human dignity and the children's rights does not result from this or that SM modality, but from its very principle, the use of a woman as a gestator and the handing over of the child. The nature of the contract, which organizes the disposition of the human being, is not affected by whether or not it is remunerated. Ethical SM cannot exist any more than ethical slavery. Then, once the child is born from SM, it is very delicate to find satisfactory solutions. In particular, nothing will make it possible for it to return to a maternal filiation that is legible. This is why it is a priori necessary to intervene. One means is penal repression because of its dissuasive effect. Another would be a commitment to a development of an international legal instrument for the international condemnation of practice.
Thank you, Mrs. Mirkovic, for showing this extreme legal complexity of who's the mother, who's the father of the child, and for raising the point that reproductive exploitation is clearly a new form of slavery, and even worse, actually, due to the physical and psychological constraints. Now we will talk about the woman's perspective with Ms. Caroline Roux. Caroline Roux is a director of Vita International, an NGO active in counseling and personal care for vulnerable people. She was also involved in the network No Maternity Traffic, an international coalition acting for the ban on reproductive exploitation. Once again, don't forget to choose the translation if you want to hear the speech in English, but you may indeed follow it in the original language. Ms. Caroline Roux, you have the floor. And you have to turn on your mic. Vous devez allumer votre micro.
My contribution is based on our experience in supporting women and couples facing difficulties in motherhood. Above all, it will be a humanitarian approach which leads to raise major ethical and human issues. It also stems from my involvement as Vice President of No Maternity Traffic, the European coalition calling for the global abolition of surrogacy. What is SM in reality? It is a procedure whereby a woman carries a child for the account of others, whether for payment or not, and undertakes to hand the child over to sponsors at the end of the pregnancy. SM has made headlines in recent years about the exploitation of poor women, particularly in countries such as India, Thailand, and Ukraine. But there is also a so-called luxury SM in the case of the United States, with the ultra-liberal system where commercial agencies do business, taking advantage of the precarious situation of American women in couples. Generally speaking, this results in double exploitation. That of the suffering of children's couples, and that of the misery and precariousness of surrogate mothers. Who are the people tempted by its SM? Firstly, women who are unable to bear children in the event of female infertility linked to dysfunctions of the uterus, either of a congenital nature, MRKH syndrome, or accidentally following a curettage, following childbirth, miscarriage, or abortion, or for medical reasons in the event of removal of a uterus or cancer. Secondly, this practice is also claimed by men alone or in same-sex couples to have a child by older women or in countries in the USA, although it is still uncommon to prevent women from carrying a child. So, what is the process? To avoid the surrogate mother's attachment to the child she is carrying, SM's commercial agencies promote that there is no genetic link with the child, except in the rare cases where the oocytes of the applicant women are used. The most common practice is to use the services of an egg donor selected from a catalogue. In both cases, the child's motherhood can be broken up into fragmented maternity ward, which can involve up to 3 women. Firstly, the oocyte donor, secondly, the surrogate mother, and thirdly, the woman educator, or the total suppression of the maternal link in the education when it is a question of male demands. In other words, this leads to a legal ill-treatment and a complete biological and legal confusion in terms of filiation for the children born from the practice. For some, it is just another form of medically assisted procreation. However, if France, Spain, Germany, and other countries formally prohibit it, including for pathological reasons, it is because SM involves particular violence for women and children. This is not to underestimate the immense ordeal of discovering an inability to bear a child. It is really important that we can hear, listen, and accompany the suffering of women and couples, as we do in our help and listening services, SOS Baby. However, desire has limits when it infringes on the rights of others. It is important to remember at this point that there is no right to the child. Otherwise, it would equate the child with a thing. Today we see that supply creates demand, and in doing so weakens the awareness that SM raises crucial human rights issues. Firstly, the one of intentionally provoking in a premeditated manner the abandonment of a child in order to hand him or her over to other people. Secondly, using a woman's body for 9 months and then making her disappear from the child's life. And thirdly, that of merchandising this child, which is the object of the contract. This opens the door to exploitations and is insidious abuse. A. By instituting the deliberate abandonment of the child, SM runs counter to discoveries and progress in the field of maternal and pediatric health. Observations carried out for several decades around pregnancy show the importance and richness of psychological and emotional bonds created between mother and child, to the point that these interactions model the child's genetic data, which is called epigenetics. Today in Western societies, birth professionals favour physical contact with the mother at birth, called skin to skin, to ensure a sensory continuum and to make the separation of childbirth more peaceful for the child. The female body says a lot. You have to be aware of the consequence of the postpartum. Those forms of depression that some women experience after birth of the first child, in order to perceive what the physiological imprint of the pregnancy can be. Moreover, the experiences of adoption shows how much the separation of child from woman who bore him or her is an ordeal for him or her, as well as for the mother who has to part with the child. Internationally provoking this rupture is a serious attack on the identity of both women and the child. For motherhood is unique and original in that it constitutes an inseparable mother-child unit. Women are considered as producers of children by praising their bodies, which is completely contradicts the woman's dignity. SM presents itself as a new form of exploitation of women's bodies. The spokeswoman for a French association that helps prostituted women said how struck she was by the similarities with the prostitution system. I quote her, "Individual freedom and consent are put forward, whereas this obviously denies all economic, social and macho realities. The inequalities of race, which will force women, because they need money, to consent either to have sexual relations, this is prostitution, or to bear a child for others, in this case SM. For we must be clear, with SM, women will submit to the domination of the applicants to ensure that the child will be in accordance with their wishes, which is tantamount to slavery. The National Ethics Committee in France has analysed surrogacy contracts in the United States. Among the particularly binding articles are the following. The surrogate mother must accept the medical follow-up required by the applicants. The surrogate mother must agree not to have sexual relations during certain periods, to adopt a certain special diet, and to prohibit certain activities. She must commit, at the request of the sponsors, to accept a selective abortion if they refuse twins or triplets, or if a disability is detected. And finally, she must renounce all rights to the child after its birth. These contracts give rise to inextricable disputes, not to mention the fact that, like any pregnancy, SM involves risks for the mother's health, both physical and psychological, and that not everything can be predicted. In particular, the female body is not made to carry an embryo that is foreign to her, so that the surrogate mother's body does not reject an embryo. She is given high doses of hormones, and as a result, the medical risks are increased, and in particular, the risk of high blood pressure and gestational diabetes. C. The child is subject of a contract of sale or donation, which is tantamount to trafficking in human beings. Prices vary from $25,000 to over $150,000, depending on the country. The result is a quality control on the child thus produced, which implies eugenic practices so that the child meets as closely as possible the criteria required by the applicants. The case of little Gammy in Thailand, who was born with Down syndrome in 2013, caused a worldwide scandal. He was refused by an Australian couple who only kept his twin, leaving the Down syndrome child to the surrogate mother. In conclusion, some argue that there could be an ethical, acceptable SM. The trap is based on a largely fictitious opposition between altruistic and commercial SM. It is a trap that reduces and confines the moral appreciation of SM to one of its secondary, albeit very serious aspects, money. In fact, the problem with ABPM is the situation of the child and the mother who carries it. Moreover, the consequences on filiation are no less serious when the child has been carried for free by someone else to him. By a sister, by a friend, an aunt, a grandmother, the emotional pressure and the confusion are even greater. In reality, the problem with SM is SM itself. Today, Europe and European elected representatives have a major responsibility to assert human rights, especially the rights of women and children against exploitation. Positive signs should encourage us. Faced with this exploitation of women and child trafficking, several countries have revised their legislation in recent years to prohibit SM for foreigners in India, Thailand, Nepal, Mexico, among others. And the only realistic approach is to commit to fight this form of human trafficking at national and international level. If we don't want humans to become commodities for other humans, for this is the central question. In the name of individual desires, we must not abdicate the dignity of human of women and children.
Thank you, Ms. Roux, for explaining the similarities between reproductive exploitation and prostitution, among others, to have long debates about the so-called ethical surrogacy is, yes, actually worthless, as one cannot create an ethical slavery. Now we will discuss of the child's perspective with Professor Carmen Sanchez Maillo. Mrs. Sanchez Maillo is professor of law theory at the University San Pablo CEU in Madrid. She is the academic secretary of the Institute of Family Studies of the same university, and she is a member of the cultural platform One of Us for a Europe faithful to the human dignity. This speech will be presented in Spanish, so you may have the translation to English. If you prefer the speech in Spanish, keep the original language. Mrs. Sanchez Maillo, you have the floor.
Muy bien. Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por tener esta posibilidad de poder hablar. Muchas gracias a doña Margarita de la Pisa por organizar y por dejarnos expresar en este foro, igual que a todos los organizadores. Mi ponencia se titula Niños a demanda, una perspectiva antropológica.
My paper focuses on the perspective of the baby that comes into the world as a result of IVF, along with the contract for the surrogate. At this moment, I want to be the voice of that person who is called to life as a result of the production process to which a purchase and sale is added, a commercial operation for its gestation. I think that it's reasonable to ask, is this a humane and dignified way to be born, to be called into existence? We could for a moment put ourselves in his shoes and ask ourselves, how would you like to come into the world? I believe that children called up in this way are subject to inequality from the moment of their conception and gestation. They are always imposed with alienation and sometimes the anonymity of the mother who has carried them in their womb for the 9 months, who has donated her blood and her body, her food, the one who has heard the first beats of her heart, and who has sheltered their growth and movement throughout the pregnancy. Anyone who stops to think for even a moment about the mother-child bond that has generated in this pregnancy will realize how inhumane and unnatural this legalized practice is here in the 21st century. It forces the born to begin its existence in a womb that is alien to its destiny and family environment. It is important to insist on this point. It is an obligation imposed on the person called into existence in this way. It obliges him to be born in a place that is no longer necessarily maternal, a place that is alien to other men throughout their history. Is this not discrimination? Is this circumstance compatible with his character as a unique and unrepeatable person? The legalization of surrogacy in some European countries, such as the United Kingdom, Greece, or others such as Russia, Australia, the United States, India, Ukraine, and Georgia, is a practice that represents an involution of civilization. It is a real turning point in the course of Western civilization. Already Roman law established that there was a res extra commercium, those goods that were outside the legal business and therefore could not be the object of any contract or agreement. This wise and ancient limitation indicated that trade also had limits and that there were realities that had to be outside of trade. And yet, in the 21st century, trade in human beings is allowed and legislated, clearly approaching one of the greatest scourges of the ancient world, that's to say, human slavery. We can consider this practice the new slavery of the century. If the trade in women's wombs is legal, where are the prohibitions on trading in human organs? The risks of generalizing the trade in very personal and bodily aspects are obvious. Only an absolute ban on trade in any aspect of the human body guarantees the freedom of the weak in a globalized world. The person is not a thing, so he or she should not be treated as such. The person keeps his or her dignity intact no matter what his or her life is like. Conceived, old, sick, or disabled, even after their death. If, on the contrary, the person is treated as a thing, the logic of production, consumption, and its necessary replacement is entered into as if it were a commodity, and the consequence is that if it has a defect, it can be disposed of. The consequence is not a hypothesis that has already been verified in reality. This was the case of Patamon Chanhua, a Thai woman who was hired to gestate a human being. She became pregnant with twins, one of whom had Down syndrome since conception, and the parents did not want to take care of him. The One of Us Foundation in 2016 awarded a prize for the courage of this Thai woman who wanted to take on and raise this rejected twin. Another real case is that of two men, who are a couple, who came to the United States to hire a surrogate under the following conditions. Each of them would fertilize an egg from the same woman with their genetic material. They returned to their country with siblings from a biological and pregnant mother, but from different fathers. The two cases described above tell us that having children through this technique, which adds to IVF the surrender of the woman's womb, objectifies and instrumentalizes both the child to be born and the mother who's contractually bound to bear it, establishing a process of production and a logic that all human desire must become a right, placing the desire of the contracting parent above the superior interest of the human being called into existence in this way. The latter interest should be taken into account in all legal processes, as is the case with processes related to minors, whether it be guardianship, adoption, or fostering. The best interest of the child is a set of actions and processes that guarantee an internal development and a dignified life, as well as the material and emotional conditions that allow a dignified life and the achievement of a maximum welfare. The best interest of the child appears in international and state regulations as a criterion for adopting any measure affecting a child. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted by the UN in 1989, states in Article 3 that in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, The best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. In the same vein, the best interest of the child is a principle enshrined in the constitutions and child protection laws of European countries. These laws stipulate that the interest of the child takes precedence over any other legitimate interest that may be involved. Going deeper into this issue, the law on minors in Spain includes a series of criteria that must be assessed as basic needs, material, physical, educational, and also emotional and affective, as well as consideration of the wishes, feelings, and opinions of the minor. The child has the right to be informed, heard, and listened to. Taking into account this international principle of the best interest of the child, I ask myself, and I ask you, if the practice of surrogacy does not harm these interests of the child. Is his life being objectified? Where is the possibility for him to meet his mother who gave him birth and perhaps also who donated his genetic material if he is different from the one who is raising him? How can the voice and the legitimate interests of the person who comes into the world through this practice of surrogacy be heard? Who ensures the right to know his biological origins to the one who is thus called to life? The fact that in some European countries the practice of surrogacy is allowed is an anthropological and cultural break with Europe's Greco-Latin and Christian roots. Breaking with the protection that Roman law has already granted to the nascituras, with the reflection on an order in human nature that Greek philosophy bequeathed to us, and the concept of the person and his dignity that we inherited from Christian anthropology. For all the reasons mentioned in this forum, it seems urgent to draw attention to this trade in people which should not exist, as there is an urgent need to repeal the legislation which allows the inhuman, unfair and objectionable practice of surrogacy in Europe.
Por todas las razones aludidas, desde este foro parece apremiante llamar la atención sobre este comercio de personas que no debería existir, siendo urgente la derogación de la legislación que permite en Europa la práctica inhumana, injusta y cosificadora de los vientres de alquiler. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sanchez Maillo, for your speech. And we really apologize for the problems of connection from some speakers and from some translators. We hope it will be fixed for the best hearing of everyone. So Mrs. Sanchez Maillo, you have emphasized the trade of human beings, and you mentioned the Article 3 of the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. Thank you. As explained earlier, there is also the Article 7, I think, who provides that children should know their parents as much as possible. We cannot forget those very important legal instruments. And now, for the final panelist, we will talk about the surrogacy markets in the European Union with Mrs. Laetitia Pouliquen. Laetitia Pouliquen is the author of the book Women 2.0, Feminism and Transhumanism. She advocates at the European institutions on the impact of new technology on the feminine identity and on family issues. So, Ms. Pouliquen, you have the floor. Don't forget to turn on your mic first.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mathieu. Thank you so very much, Mrs. de la Pisa, for hosting this very important event. It's a one-off. I hope we'll have many other opportunities to speak about reproductive exploitation. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable members of parliament, among the audience, thank you very much for being here. I would like to cover today two important aspects: the economical aspects of reproductive exploitation as well as the political challenges in the coming years, and especially in this mandate, as we've noticed, and as Mathieu has mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar, i.e. a beam of evidence that the European Commission is actually willing to make it happen, to make it possible within the EU, within even the 13 EU member states that ban the practice of surrogacy. I'm going to switch to my slides. I'm going to share with you to make it as striking as can be. There we go. I guess you can see some of it, but I'm trying to put it in there. Mathieu, is this okay?
Yes, it is okay.
Thank you.
We can see it.
All right. So reproductive exploitation, economical and political aspects. So first, let's see what market size and what forecasts we're talking about. You first have to realize, and this has been said a few times, mentioning Australia, mentioning Thailand, that this market is highly international, and it actually created a whole ecosystem, a huge lucrative pie that many types of businesses try to tap into. On this map, you can see in deep blue the countries around the world that allow for all forms of surrogacy. In gray blue, those who have no legal regulations, and that's Belgium specifically. In turquoise, only altruistic surrogacy is legal, and we'll see how altruistic doesn't mean a thing in that it allows for compensation, which is pretty much the same as a payment. In purple, we have the countries that allow surrogacy among relatives, and it's mostly Brazil, which is some sort of weird arrangements. In red, you'll see the countries that have actually make it illegal by law, the practice of surrogacy, and in gray, mostly Africa and certain situations. As you can see, Spain, France, Italy, Germany supposedly have a ban, Czech Republic supposedly have a ban but yet it is happening on their own territory, as children were born from surrogate mothers abroad and recognized even with birth certificates in these countries with false arguments, with very fallacious arguments. A reminder, 13 EU member states make it illegal. And also something we need to keep in mind is that there is a very wide array of compensation to the surrogate mothers, also called baby carriers. And it ranges from 4,000 in India to 20,000 roughly in the United States per baby. Now, we have to understand one thing, is that the market, the surrogacy market, is actually part of the ART market. ART means artificial reproductive technology. And this ART market was valued at $25 billion in 2019. Artificial reproductive technologies encompasses the whole of IVF, surrogacy, IVF devices, and all sorts of service providing as well, like hormonal stimulation, etc. And so this market is expected to grow up to $50 billion by 2027. So as you can see, this is going to be very relevant. Opportunity growth assessment is of 12% in Asia Pacific and a big 9% in Europe. The reasons behind this growing market is actually the rising incidence of infertility due to changing lifestyles, due to aging mothers, due to LGBTQ+ demands, due to intensive working hours, also to governments encouraging and funding the practice of IVF as well as surrogacy to fight against demography. You know, as we all know, demography is going through a winter, and some of these countries have actually agreed that IVF and surrogacy might be a good reason, a good way of fighting against this. And of course, huge financial interests. Now, speaking of a smaller market, a subsegment of this ART market is the IVF market. The IVF market revenue is $18 billion in 2019. It has a projection of $38 billion by 2027. We've actually funded a research from a consultancy firm in the United States to be more specific about surrogacy. So ART, and then you have IVF market revenue and surrogacy revenues. Finally, when you speak solely about surrogacy, what we can say is that it's been really hard to find out the figures. It is a highly secretive and protective market, and surrogacy agencies do not publish their figures. And what we can say at this point is that probably if you take the ART figures of $25 billion, if you subtract $18 billion in IVF and another $800 million in IVF device market, if it is not already included in the IVF market, then we might think of a surrogacy market in 2019 of $6.7 billion on surrogacy alone. Now, if we go deep inside the countries and get into more details, on the right-hand side, you have a publicity, an advertisement on a website that was trying to actually advertise the fact that Ukraine and Laos were very cheap countries, where are countries where you can find the low-cost surrogacy. You can see actually Georgia is at the top and at the bottom, because if you have a guaranteed baby birth in Georgia, it's $60K. If you want to have a standard IVF donor, it's only $42K. That's why this market is really hard to understand and to encompass. Anyway, in the USA, since 1970, it happens to be the first country where surrogacy was practiced, more than 40,000 births to date. And many of them are for foreigners. We can actually estimate this to be a 3,000 births a year, if not more. Surrogacy in the United States is between 110 and 170,000 per child for a full positive pregnancy package. That means you have a full guarantee that there will be a child. So when you click on your click and collect button on your website to purchase your baby, you will get it for sure, whatever happens, under the conditions that you've asked for: blue-eyed, white Caucasian, with donor, screen donor, etc., etc. India has a reputation of being low cost. It has 1,000 clinics, and supposedly for resident only. They were trying to change the law, but unfortunately we still witness that this market is for 99% for the exportation. The average cost is around 25,000, and we can round this market size to $2.15 billion. And as you can see, this is only a 2012 figure. All of those figures that I'm trying to present to you today are somewhat outdated. They're so hard to find that some of them go way back to 2012. Russia, 1,000 births, $22,000 on average for the transaction cost. Thailand, $46,000 for resident only, but there again, we know for a fact that the government has found it, despite the law change in 2016, has found it extremely difficult to make sure that those countries, those babies would not leave the country. Ukraine is actually the new haven of surrogacy with 1,000 births, and Biotexcom claims just for this one surrogacy agency 500 births a year. It costs between 44,000 and 80,000, and mothers in Ukraine collect around $15,000 per birth. In Georgia, what was published in 2013 was 170 babies. Nepal, we don't know how many babies, but it's around 30,000. Israel, the same. Mexico is actually another haven for surrogacy, 50 clinics now. And the cost is actually quite high. It's around 105,000 per child. What they claim is that they get the best weather to conceive. I'm trying to make you laugh here, but I'm being sarcastic, of course. In the United Kingdom, which only allows for altruistic surrogacy, they claimed 368 surrogate births in 2018. And this is public, the health ministry publishing those information. For once, we have very official numbers. And the cost is 65,000. Now, the United Kingdom, as well as Belgium, that I have not mentioned, have the specificity that the pregnancy costs are covered by the social security system. That means every taxpayer in the country actually contributes to the birth of those babies born through surrogacy. So basically, based on my outdated values, this adds up to roughly $3 billion compared to the 6.7 that I gave to you as a figure to take into consideration in my first slide. And the discrepancy, again, is due to the secrecy behind this practice. Now, behind all the surrogacy market, there's a huge ecosystem that constitutes a huge lucrative pie. Egg harvesting, around 3,000 per cycle, with a 250 annual fee for storage. In Spain alone, a woman who gives oocytes can collect around 1,000 euros. In Belgium, where only altruistic donations are allowed, that means no selling of body parts, Belgian women or students, because that's what they do, can collect between 500 and 2,000 euros per cycle, where up to 6 or 7 oocytes are collected. Sperm collection, very cheap, $50 in India, $2,000 in the United States per vial, per specimen, according to screening. If you went to Harvard, if you're white, Caucasian, blue-eyed, then you'll be able to sell your sperm very high. Genome screening can be up to $8,000 a genome. However, this cost is drastically going down because of technology, because of big data and computer power. Termination of pregnancy, hysterectomy, loss of reproductive capabilities, all of this is provided for by contract in the arrangement, in the surrogacy arrangement, which demonstrates clearly that there are risks taken by the surrogate mother. I've mentioned instruments and devices to improve the IVF result rates, and this is a global amount of $800 million increasing daily on a daily basis. Now, pharmaceutical labs with hormones, antidepressants, research labs with genome sequencing, embryo selection, embryo modifications, this is all big pharma, and it's all very critical for them to concentrate and keep on pushing this business. Many other types of service providers, insurance, lawyers, banks with loans, psychoanalysts, demonstrating that there is tons of women suffering from PTSD upon relinquishing their babies that need help. Private companies, that's very interesting to know, that private companies offer surrogacy benefits to their employees. Salesforce, for instance, if you're up to having a baby through surrogacy arrangement, can offer up to $10,000, and Facebook $20,000. As you've understood, all those economical aspects are actually underlying the political changes and the political challenges that need to be made in the EU. So this is a very rough transition, and I apologize for covering two important topics, but you might understand the intricacy between money and policy and policies. The EU need to stand for non-discrimination, to stand for no maternity trafficking. But what happens now is that we tend to find evidence that EU, especially the European Commission and the European Court of Justice, are in collusion with this practice and this market. Ursula von der Leyen just last September said, "I will push for mutual recognition of family relations in the EU. If you're a parent in one country, you're a parent in every country." Commissioner Vera Jourova for Values and Transparency, as well as Helena Dalli, Commissioner for Equality, presented their strategy just last November. They said, due to differences in national legislations across member states, family ties may not always be recognized when rainbow families cross the EU's internal borders. The Commission will bring forward a legislative initiative on the mutual recognition of parenthood. So as you can see, on the guise of non-discrimination, all families, all forms of families should be allowed to practice all sorts of surrogacy, create fallacious parenthood, and discriminate against those vulnerable women. The European Court of Justice, in the Carmen judgment, a Romanian from Romania, who took this to the European Court of Justice in 2018, stated that the national constitutions cannot prevail on the right to filiations already recognized in another member state, thus imposing the legal consequences of all forms of unions across the EU. Beyond the EU and the member states and the Eurozone, you have the Hague Conference on International Private Law. The Hague Conference, which you might not be aware of, has always been working on private law, on harmonizing private law across 84 countries, member countries. What it is doing right now in the project Parentage/Surrogacy is that it's been working for the past 10 years and will come to conclusion in March 2021 to provide a framework to recognize parenthood of intended parents at the expense of the biological mother or the sperm/oocyte donor. What it effectively does is that the Hague Conference promotes surrogacy without any public consultation. So my call to action for members of parliaments listening to my speech, what I humbly recommend is, one, the European Parliament in all its reports, whenever possible, including in the Santos report that Mathieu introduced to you, the Human Rights and Democracy report in the world in 2019, should introduce and adopt a firm condemnation of surrogacy by the European Parliament. That's one, and we need to work on this, and I would really be grateful if you would humbly check your mails for the voting recommendations that we'd make. Second, encourage the European Commission to make reproduction exploitation and pregnancy contracts matter of legal policy, to definitely stop maternity trafficking in the EU for children born in the EU or outside of the EU. And three, at the national level, members of parliament, you can ask the question to your governments regarding the Hague Conference, what their stance is on this parentage and parenthood project, because they're taking decisions on your behalf, on the behalf of the citizens of your country, and these are going to be binding decisions. It is really critical that we make this public, that we expose them. So my conclusion is that if we don't call for an international ban on reproductive exploitation, is that this violation of women's and children's rights, as it's been said throughout the whole webinar, will continue to promote human trafficking. Maternal mobbing and harassment, mothers giving birth in companies, be it public or private, are mobbed, they are harassed, and this will continue since surrogacy will be proposed more and more by companies just to make sure that they become economic agent, that they become, that they stop being a weight to the company for the sake of their pregnancy. The question for the younger generation is, will it be possible to a young lady to become an ecological mother, giving birth naturally, giving birth to a non-genetically selected or modified baby? And this might be become possible, as Mr. Tolichowski says, the Biotexcom Ukraine surrogacy agency. At some point, we won't need ladies anymore. We'll have artificial uterus. I thank you very much for listening to this speech and taking actions.
Thank you, Mrs. Pouliquen, for developing the huge power of financial interest. It was so shocking to understand that babies are bought on an international market, actually. Thank you also for calling to action for MPs, whether at the national level for the Hague Conference on Private Law, or within the European institutions as we are now. I'm sure that you also have some personal remarks, Mrs. de la Pisa Carrion, you wanted probably to share with us after all those speeches. Please. Don't forget to turn on your microphone. Thank you.
¿Qué tal? Bueno, pues hemos podido ver, ¿no? El asunto tan complejo.
So, in view of all that has been set out today, it has been clear that we need to take responsibility for continuing to pursue the lines that have been opened up, work in research forums, debates, talks, training in order to generate ideas and arguments. To be able to respond in a serious and forceful way against the threats that are dehumanizing our society, drowning it in despair. We can only achieve this together, faithful to the humanistic and transcendent values that are our cultural roots. In this regard, I would like to invite my fellow MEPs to take a stand in favour of the dignity of the individual and to show this commitment in the political life of the European Parliament and to join forces in this fight. We really are facing an opportunity to act against a new form of exploitation, and we cannot remain silent. Now we need a lot of dedication in order to achieve the objectives that we've set ourselves. to be loud and clear voice that allows us to re-inspire the heart and conscience of so many people with a lack of references. Finally, as host of this conference, I would like to thank Matthew, Aude, Carolina, Carmen, Laetitia, Ana del Pino for her work behind the scenes, the interpreters, the organizations One of Us, Europe for Family, and to all of you who have followed us today, and for your questions in the chat. Thank you. You have enriched us greatly with your knowledge and understanding of this crucial issue. I hope we can all meet soon. This time, we're using this online medium, which is a good way to work, but I will be happy to meet you and invite you to the European Parliament. Count on us MEPs. I am at your disposal and my door is always open. Thank you.
Carmen, Laetitia, Ana del Pino, por su trabajo detrás de las cámaras, los intérpretes. Sé que ha habido problemas con la interpretación. Tomamos el compromiso de reeditar este vídeo, ¿no? con una interpretación adecuada para que mensajes tan importantes como los que se han dicho hoy puedan llegar a todos vosotros. Asumimos ese compromiso y os haremos llegar, ¿no? a la edición de ese vídeo para que podáis volver a ver el vídeo y poder entender adecuadamente a cada uno de los ponentes. A las organizaciones como One of Us, a Europe for Family, a todos los que habéis seguido hoy, porque sabemos que es un asunto que a todos nos inquieta. Gracias por vuestras preguntas en el chat. Gracias, nos habéis enriquecido muchísimo y vuestro conocimiento nos ha ayudado a entender un poquito más este complejo tema crucial. Espero poder encontrarnos pronto. En esta ocasión hemos utilizado este medio online, pero tengo ganas de invitaros al Parlamento Europeo, ¿no? Contad con nosotros, con mi equipo. Estoy a vuestra disposición. Mi puerta está siempre abierta. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mrs. de Pisa, for those important remarks. We also look forward working with you on those issues, and we are eager to see the video with the adequate translation. Sorry for the unstable connections of speakers or translators. If you need more information, do not also to email us at contacts@europeforfamily.eu, and you will be able to receive our white paper on reproductive exploitation. Thank you to all the speakers, ladies, as I was quite the only guy on the screen. Ladies, you were both wise and passionate. Thank you to all. And I also wanted to thank the other members of the European Parliament who didn't talk live, but who were attending this webinar. And we will be glad to see you on another future event at the European Parliament, maybe physically also. Hopefully. Thank you to all and goodbye, good afternoon. Have a nice weekend. Goodbye.
Goodbye.